This meeting is being recorded.
The Subcommittee on International Development, International Organizations, and Global Corporate Social Impact will come to order. Good morning, everyone. Two things. First, we have members that are coming back from a vote on a motion to adjourn, and also we'll try to raise the volume a little bit so we can hear the folks off the computer a little bit better. Thank you to our witnesses for being here today for our hearing entitled, "A Year into the Pandemic, the State of International Development." Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess of the committee at any point, and all members will have 5 days to submit statements, extraneous material, and questions for the record, subject to the length limitation in the rules. To insert something into the record, please have your staff email the document to the previously mentioned address or contact our subcommittee staff. As a reminder to members, staff, and all others physically present in the room, per recent guidance from the Office of the Attending Physician, masks must be worn at all times during today's hearing, although sometimes we take them off when we're speaking and then put them back on. Please also sanitize your seating area. The chair views these measures as a safety issue and therefore an important matter of order and decorum for this proceeding. As a reminder to members joining remotely, please keep your video function on at all times, even when you're not recognized by the chair. Members are responsible for muting and unmuting themselves, and please remember to mute yourself after you finish speaking. Consistent with HRES 8 and the accompanying regulations, staff will only mute members and witnesses as appropriate when they're not under recognition to eliminate background noise. I see that we have a quorum, and I'll now recognize myself for opening remarks. Thank you all for joining us today for this subcommittee's first hearing. I'd like to thank Ranking Member Malliotakis and welcome all our subcommittee members, particularly members who are new to the Foreign Affairs Committee and to Congress. Our work will benefit from your unique perspectives and important contributions. It's been 1 year since the COVID-19 pandemic changed our lives. Since then, we have all seen the world and are standing in it disrupted in ways we could hardly once imagine. The pandemic has created new challenges and exposed old weaknesses in America's capabilities abroad. Our infrastructure for international development has been no exception to that. The United States' contributions to global development through USAID, the State Department, and our support for international organizations such as the United Nations, as well as through the private sector, civil society, and the generosity of individual Americans have all done incalculable good around the world. Now, however, these programs and institutions find themselves at a turning point. This hearing will serve to assess the damage, to identify development programs that may be at particular risk, and to chart a path towards rebuilding our nation's development capacity. As we begin to see the end of the pandemic in sight, we expect some of our capacity to bounce back naturally as our people return to work in person, both in Washington and around the world. However, we must also identify areas in which the damage the pandemic caused threatens to be permanent, and then work to direct resources towards rebuilding more resilient development systems that can survive the known and unknown crises to come. This task is more important than ever. Rebuilding from COVID may well be as difficult and challenging as defeating the virus itself. Global poverty has risen for the first time in decades, and the pandemic's economic impact may last years in nations already suffering from high levels of inequality, instability, and underdevelopment. Our government's efforts to foster development must address not just the direct impacts of the pandemic, but its secondary and even tertiary effects. Congress has already taken an important first step. Today, we will pass the American Rescue Plan Act, a bill that will bring much-needed relief to the American people. The bill also includes important funding for development priorities that I and this committee have been calling for. That includes, for example, almost $10 billion for health programs, disaster relief, economic support, humanitarian assistance, multilateral assistance, and the Global Fund, an important international organization that has led the fight against HIV/AIDS and tuberculosis, and now COVID-19. This hearing will inform our subcommittee's oversight over these programs. It will also identify the long-term impacts of the pandemic, which I believe our nation must lead in addressing. Early child development is one clear example of an issue that will have long-term consequences if we don't address it now. We know that the acute food insecurity faced by many children today will have a lifelong impact. Schools for nearly 170 million children have been closed for a year. Millions of children will never return to school, and most of them will be girls. The impact of this pandemic so early in the lives of millions, at home and around the world, will affect health, education, and economic incomes for their entire lives unless action is taken now. These impacts will be borne by entire societies and indeed by the world. Our commitment to international development has always been bipartisan, particularly in Congress, where we successfully resisted cuts for the last 4 years. This bipartisanship will be essential for us to meet the challenges of this important moment. If nothing else, COVID-19 has made clear that what happens over there affects us over here. Weak healthcare systems or poverty and instability that fuel extremism can all too easily reach our shores. With these new challenges ahead of us, USAID must be willing to innovate and adapt to the very changed world we now inhabit. I have every faith that, with the proper resources and support, they will be up to the task. I salute the courage of America's international development workforce that's in the field every single day. They're a critically important part of advancing our national interest and defending our national security, serving their country often in remote locations and under difficult circumstances. Our challenge now is to not only to defeat the pandemic everywhere, but also redouble our efforts to battle humanity's shared enemies, poverty, hunger, and disease, in partnership with peoples from around the world. So there's a lot of ground to cover this morning, and I look forward to hearing from each of our distinguished witnesses. But before that, I'd like to turn it over to our ranking member, Maliotakis, for her opening remarks.
Thank you, Chairman Castro. It's an honor to serve as ranking member of this subcommittee. I look forward to working with you and the rest of the committee members to conduct important oversight of our development programs and United States' engagement in international organizations. Over 2.5 million people around the world have died as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. That includes over 500,000 Americans. The pandemic has devastated communities and families, including many in my district. It has also had a crippling effect on food security, education systems, and global supply chains. The creation of this subcommittee comes at a pivotal time. To date, the United States has given $3.6 billion to help control the spread and mitigate the impacts of COVID-19. And there is another $10 billion on the way through the American Rescue Plan. Global efforts to stop the spread of COVID-19 make us safer here at home, especially as variants begin to emerge. We must continue to invest in global health security and ensure other countries can detect and respond to global health threats before outbreaks become a pandemic and reach our shores. However, Americans here at home are struggling to pay their bills and feed their families. There is justified skepticism about our international spending with the immense needs here at home. We have an obligation to conduct rigorous oversight of U.S. foreign assistance and development programs. Every dollar of our aid must be targeted, strategic, and effective. Unfortunately, the House Foreign Affairs Committee did not have the opportunity to mark up and debate the $10 billion Foreign Affairs title in the American Rescue Plan. During the Rules Committee markup, I offered a common sense amendment to transfer funding from Global Health Fund to ensure vaccines are available for all our diplomats and developmental professionals. Effective development requires getting out in the field and monitoring programs. We simply cannot expect our diplomatic service to do their jobs overseas without urgent access to vaccines. I would appreciate hearing from our witnesses what more we should be doing to ensure the safety of our workforce overseas. I'm also particularly concerned about the impact of this pandemic on developing economies and international trade. The International Monetary Fund declared this crisis the worst economic fallout since the Great Depression. It is estimated that the pandemic has cost the global economy $11 trillion and global trade has declined 9.2%. Latin America and the Caribbean will experience the worst economic contraction in the region's history. These contractions not only hurt local communities, but they also impact United States businesses looking to invest in emerging markets. The world's fastest growing companies are located in the global south, and many of them were hard hit by this pandemic. USAID has done critical work over the last 2 decades to promote economic prosperity, build the capacity of trade partners, and create the environment for U.S. private sector investment. The COVID-19 pandemic threatens to undermine these gains as backsliding in food security, health and economic systems, and governance ultimately hurts the investment climate and acts to commercial markets. I would appreciate hearing from the witnesses on how our development programs can address these issues. Ultimately, foreign aid alone is not going to solve development challenges. Our development programs must be designed as partnerships with the goal of creating stable, self-reliant communities that don't need foreign aid. That is why I support the important role of the U.S. private sector in building infrastructure, creating jobs, and advancing sustainable solutions to development challenges both here and abroad. Finally, the U.S. is not the only country offering aid. The Chinese Communist Party, who actively sought to undermine early investigations into the COVID-19 outbreak, is leveraging this pandemic to project their power and influence. Through shipments of the Sinopharm vaccine, faulty PPE, and by holding the purse strings of countries' debt relief, the CCP is looking to expand their Belt and Road Initiative and ultimately their influence in foreign capitals. That is why USAID must ensure that this aid and our development programs are clearly branded as a gift from the American people. The United States is the most generous nation in the world, but we have a duty to the American taxpayer to ensure that our aid is targeted, strategic, and maximizing the positive impact of every dollar we spend. Again, I look forward to listening to the witnesses, and I thank them for being here.
Thank you, Ranking Member Malliotakis. I will now introduce our distinguished witnesses for today. Our witnesses for today's hearing are Dr. Shah, the President of the Rockefeller Foundation and the former Administrator for the U.S. Agency for International Development, and Bonnie Glick, Senior Advisor at the Center for Strategic International Studies and Fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School, who is also the former Deputy Administrator and Chief Operating Officer of the U.S. Agency for International Development. I will now recognize each witness for 5 minutes, and without objection, your prepared written statements will be made part of the record. And I'll first call on Dr. Shah for his testimony. Oh, I think perhaps you're on mute, Dr. Shah.
Sorry, it seems I do that all day long. Thank you, Chairman Castro, for having me, and thank you, Ranking Member Malliotakis, for your opening statement and for having me as well. I see so many members of this subcommittee with whom I've had the chance to work when I served at USAID as the administrator there for nearly 6 years, and I'm thrilled to report that during that period of time, I experienced an exceptional level of bipartisan support for the basic idea that American leadership around the world, particularly on disease, on hunger, and on creating opportunity for the world's most vulnerable people, became an area of strong bipartisan consensus, and I hope that tradition continues forward. American leadership to tackle the crisis that have been identified by both the chairman and the ranking member in their opening statements will be absolutely critical. In fact, more needed now than ever as we look to the future. When I left USAID, I served in the private sector for a while, and now I run the Rockefeller Foundation, which has for more than 100 years worked to build public-private partnerships and leverage science, technology, and innovation to lift up those who are vulnerable. And I think we've learned through those efforts that, in fact, American leadership is indispensable on the global stage when it comes to tackling the challenges in front of us. And I'd like to highlight 3 of those challenges that I believe warrant urgent leadership from the United States and from its foreign aid and assistance institutions. The first, of course, is COVID. And while more than 500,000 Americans have tragically been lost to this crisis, we know that millions have died around the world. And we know that, frankly, the crisis will continue for a much longer period of time in developing and emerging nations than in the United States if current trends around vaccination, access to therapeutics, and the ability to be safe hold. We know that when you look around the world, we will expect to have large amounts of viral replication and viral presence and prevalence, even as the United States, hopefully sometime this year, achieves real herd immunity and starts to put the pandemic behind us. And that presents two major threats to the American people and the American economy. First, estimates have ranged from that we will lose $3 to $9 trillion in economic value from disrupted supply chains and the presence of the COVID crisis around the world, even when the United States economy and society recovers. But second, and perhaps much more worrying, is that new variants, which are almost certain to become a reality, have no ability to observe boundaries and borders. New variants already from the UK and South Africa present real risks and threats in the United States. And we expect that, especially as viral replication is so much more prominent, 4 to 8 times more likely in the developing and emerging world than in the United States, we can expect that those new variants can present a real risk to the nature of the US economic recovery and to the health of Americans that would like to put COVID-19 behind us. For that reason, it's absolutely urgent that the world come up with a solution to the funding and operational gaps that are preventing a full-on effort to tackle COVID-19 in emerging economies and developing countries. In particular, the ACT Accelerator, which is the representation of global needs when it comes to fighting the pandemic, has highlighted a funding gap this year alone of $23 billion that still exists in order to help the world mount a full recovery. The United States has been generous already, assuming the $4 billion for COVAX and the $10 billion that were referenced earlier go through and become the reality of law in the United States. However, the gap still remains. And in order for the US to lead the world in tackling that gap, we will likely both have to do more and bring together multilateral partners through the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and other institutions where we can use our voice and our leadership to really solve this funding gap and ensure that everyone around the world has access to safe and reliable and effective vaccines, therapeutics, and diagnostics, as that will be critical to tackling COVID-19 around the world. I look forward to sharing some specific thoughts on how to do that. But let me just say, from my own experience, I'm convinced that American leadership on that specific topic will be the only way the world tackles the funding gap that exists and the only way the world can come together to access the supplies, the tools, and the technologies needed to beat COVID-19 across the planet. Second, we face a continued hunger pandemic. We've seen the number of people hungry around the world go up. Acute hunger is now estimated to be 270 million people. I saw firsthand during famines and crises and droughts how hunger in particular leads to migration, instability, and social breakdown in ways that present real threats to the United States and to the global community. Hunger creates instability, and hunger creates massive amounts of unnecessary suffering. America has, from the inception of its foreign aid work, been the world's undisputed leader in fighting hunger, and that will have to continue. That will mean more resources for the World Food Program, but it will also mean renewed support for programs like Feed the Future and efforts to have science and enterprise-led agricultural development be a major component of America's leadership in the era going forward. I hope that we can reinvigorate those efforts and reinvest in those enterprises and those projects, because we know how to measure the results of those efforts, and we know that they sustainably and reliably help lift up communities. Finally, there will be the need for much greater assistance in a coordinated global economic recovery. It is true that developing countries and emerging economies have been hit hard by the pandemic. And it is also true that while we've done 20 to 30% of GDP in fiscal and monetary responses across wealthier nations, Emerging markets have done 6%, and developing countries have done less than 2% in order to support a real economic recovery. That's simply not enough, and it's not done in a coordinated manner, and it will not allow for a global economic recovery to be full and inclusive. So American leadership on that topic, particularly through partners like the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, will be critical to success.
Thank you,
I'll
Dr.
close
Shah.
by just saying I have had the chance to speak to Americans in churches across the country, at universities like Clemson and Rutgers, and food companies in Minneapolis. And I'm always struck by the fact that most Americans think we do so much more in foreign aid than we do. The perception is we do 20% of our budget in foreign aid. The reality is we do 1%. And when we explain what we get as results, I'm always amazed by how most American families have expressed even more support for stronger and more effective American foreign assistance to deal with the challenges we face. I think the time is now to make that real and to make it meaningful in the context of the COVID response.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your testimony. And I think for our witnesses and the members that are online, at least a minute ago, the online timer had gone out. So we'll try to help you stay on time from here. But also, let me go over now to Ms. Glick, and if you want to take a little extra time also, please feel free. We've only got 2 witnesses today, so we should be okay on time.
Thank you, Chairman Castro. Thank you, Ranking Member Maliotakis and members of the committee. I won't speak a million miles an hour then as I go forward. Thank you all for the invitation to speak with the subcommittee today about some of the challenges facing USAID in the current environment that includes the COVID-19 pandemic and the global response to it. I served as a Deputy USAID Administrator and Chief Operating Officer of the agency from January 2019 to November 2020. The remarks I make today are solely in my personal capacity. Consistent bipartisan support for U.S. foreign assistance, regardless of the party in the White House or the majority party in the House or Senate, has been the hallmark of our foreign policy and one of the greatest examples of American generosity that we can point to overseas. The American people and their representatives understand that even as we have domestic needs at home, our lengthy and historic generosity overseas is never in doubt. That said, our fiscal well is not bottomless. Priorities change. Unforeseen crises erupt all the time and call for U.S. action. Yet despite the merits of responding to these challenges, the urgency and the need for flexibility to respond are constrained as more and more of USAID's programmatic activities are scripted and predetermined. Regardless of what else is discussed here today, the continued failure to address the harmful aspects of congressional earmarks would be insincere. And while others may focus on where the U.S. should be funding in the near future, I want to discuss key issues relating to how the U.S. should fund and implement these programs. This includes partnerships with new allied donors, as well as with the private sector. It also includes the increased use of innovation and digital technologies to apply 21st century solutions to today's problems. And while vaccine delivery to developing countries is clearly a health-related issue, the mechanism that underlies it is not: a secure and reliable supply chain with redundancy built into it. USAID has been lucky since the earliest days of the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, or PEPFAR, in 2003, to have recognized the need to invest in robust and secure supply chain capabilities. From a U.S. national security perspective, we must ensure that USAID and other government agencies focus on the safety and security of the global distribution of goods by moving to onshore, nearshore, and allied shore our manufacturing and production bases. Because what happens if we don't make these critical onshore, nearshore, and allied shore moves? The People's Republic of China will fill the void. We have seen this time and again. Development is a key area of our strategic competition with the PRC. The U.S. needs a development agency equipped to win that competition, which requires a change in mindset at USAID and Congress's help to realize the agency's full potential. USAID missions spend an enormous amount of time focused on how a single project can address multiple earmarks, thereby allowing dollars generously funded by Congress to extend further. But this gymnastics exercise diverts attention from the big picture funding opportunities where USAID can be used as an effective and strategic tool to counter a resurgent China. USAID will turn 60 this year. I strongly recommend that USAID think bigger. Larger scale projects in fewer countries may be the wave of the next 60 years. And while USAID focuses on fewer but larger projects, this is a perfect opportunity for burden sharing with our allies and partners. It's important to discuss the expansion of our alliances. Given COVID and the trillions of dollars that the US has taken on in debt for our own relief, it's important to embrace more and new donors. We worked closely when I was at USAID, for example, with Israel, India, the United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, and others to broaden the tent of donor countries. We should continue in those efforts, particularly as countries like India move away from being aid recipients to being aid donors. We should recognize and celebrate other donors' contributions. And in the wake of the Abraham Accords, we should certainly celebrate that donor countries like the UAE and Israel are now able to collaborate jointly on aid programs around the world. Fostering this kind of creativity and creative thinking, particularly by engaging with the private sector, will go a long way to making the Abraham Accords permanent and to maintaining a very warm peace. Creative thinking through partnership with private industry and through the use of digital technology will also stretch scarce budget dollars more effectively and assist in job creation in parts of the world that were terribly impacted economically by COVID-19. The non-health imperatives for development are clear. They include food insecurity, diminished livelihoods, increased outmigration, an uptick in violence against women, and others that we haven't even considered yet. USAID should focus its resources on where it can have the greatest impact and partner with allied countries when it makes more sense for them to be the primary donors. If we don't fund jointly with our allies, we risk ceding the table to China. We have spent the entirety of the modern era as the most generous nation in the history of the world. It is a role that is uniquely American and should remain American. Thank you very much, and I look forward to the opportunity to answer your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Glick, and thank you to both our witnesses for your testimony. I'll now recognize members for 5 minutes each, and pursuant to House rules, all time yielded is for the purposes of questioning our witnesses. Because of the hybrid format of this hearing, I will recognize members by committee seniority, alternating between majority and the minority members. If you miss your turn, please let our staff know and we'll circle back to you. If you seek recognition, you must unmute your microphone and address the chair verbally. And I'll start by recognizing myself. This, of course, is the first hearing of this subcommittee, and we have a new president and a new Congress. And so I want to start off with a broad question for both of either of our witnesses or both of our witnesses, if you'd like to take a shot at it. The testimony today makes clear that the United States leadership on development must be an important part of our global COVID-19 response. In the next few months, the administration will submit its budget request for fiscal year 2022, and the Congress will review that request. Given the scale of the challenge described in the testimony today, how important is it that we see a request for greater funding levels for development programs? And are there specific programs where you would put more money or move money? What are your recommendations?
Bonnie, I'm happy to start, and then, but I didn't want to interrupt if you were intending to. I would just say thank you, Chairman, for the question. I do think American leadership needs to be elevated to tackle the challenges that exist, and the challenges that exist go far beyond what American foreign affairs funding is going to be capable of solving directly. So for that purpose, I'd say three things. The first is the budget should be strong, and it should be a reinvestment in building the types of alliances that Bonnie mentioned, and making sure that we lead with our own approach, which is making bigger investments in tackling COVID-19 around the world. It's not just buying the vaccines through COVAX, which we've already made a big commitment to, but also investing in training community health workers and building out health systems so that you really can reach everyone. We learned during the Ebola crisis in 2014 that that was actually the critical investment necessary in order to successfully protect the population from the virus. I'd say second, programs that have a documented track record of being public-private partnerships and delivering results. Feed the Future, Power or Electrify Africa, other enterprise collaborations that I know Bonnie led when she was at USAID, are all the types of programs that have real data to document their effectiveness, and in my view should be invested in. And the final area is around technology and innovation. You know, America, we're seeing it right now with American ingenuity being so critical to the fight against COVID-19. But USAID created the U.S. Global Development Lab, which has earned strong bipartisan support from Congress in order to reinvigorate America's capability to make innovation, science, and technology a driver of American foreign assistance. And I hope that theme can be extended and carried forward in a much more significant way, because the challenges we face demand it, and because, frankly, American companies, American scientists, and American universities, including students on those university campuses, are eager to participate in this mission.
Thank you, Dr. Shah. I've got about a minute, 45 seconds under my time left. I'm going to try to keep myself on time. Ms. Glick, did you want to weigh in?
I'll just say very quickly that we've never lived in times like this in modern history. And so, yes, the focus on COVAX and vaccine distribution is the critical moment for the short term. As Raj said, it's accurate that being able to depend on digital technology is going to be vital, and American ingenuity that comes along with that. And so that involves engaging with the private sector, and it involves too an eye toward who else is in this space. And the answer to that, as I noted, is the People's Republic of China, and our ability to act alongside our partners and genuinely with the private sector is going to be the way that we come up with the best solutions for the world. We've done this before, and we can do it again. But we have to recognize that there's a disinformation campaign coming out of China that's discrediting American vaccines, a little bit crazy. And we have to ensure that our staff, as Raj said, have the skills and technical ability to roll out distributions worldwide. Health systems strengthening is something that helped save countless lives in Ebola in 2014 and in Ebola today in the Eastern Congo. And investing in those systems is going to be what helps us get through COVID worldwide.
Thank you, Ms. Glick. All right, Ranking Member Maliotakis.
Thank you, and I really appreciate. Thank you very much. I very much appreciate the testimony. It was enlightening, and I just had a few questions. My first question is really about, because both of you come from USAID, and my first question would be, based on your experience there, what kind of safeguards can we put in place just to make sure that the money is used most effectively? As I said in my remarks, our aid needs to be targeted, it needs to be strategic, it needs to be impactful. Do you have any recommendations on what we could be doing to ensure that?
I'll jump on this one. Ranking Member Maliotakis, one of the most important things is the partnership that USAID has with Congress and the relationship that aid has with the members to understand what we're doing in foreign assistance and how it impacts your districts. And so the congressional oversight that you and your staffs demonstrate is always going to be something that helps keep USAID on the ball in terms of being able to respond to the needs while also being responsible stewards of taxpayer dollars.
I would just quickly add that I do think, you know, there are a handful of programs, perhaps more than a handful, where USAID sets the standard on measuring results and documenting performance. And I think you can learn from those efforts and extend those practices across the full range of American foreign assistance efforts. One of the benefits of strong bilateral assistance programs, like many of the ones that USAID implements, and frankly, where the Rockefeller Foundation and others partner with USAID and so many others, is you can go out and do surveys at the beginning of a project and understand the nature of the population you're trying to serve. And then you can do annual assessments and 3 or 4 or 5 years later, do end of project assessments and actually quantify the impact you're having. We do this every day at the Rockefeller Foundation, which is how we know the 500,000 people we serve in northern India with renewable electricity access have used that access to increase their incomes by 60, 70% and create new jobs and launch new businesses and enterprises. And that basic discipline is, I think, critical to this entire field, no matter which institution is charged with the responsibility of carrying it out.
Thank you. How can we best work with America's private sector? I know that so many companies are global entities, that they're building infrastructure, they're creating jobs, they're advancing sustainable solutions. How can we best utilize them as partners? Anyone, either one of you want to answer that?
I think one of the most important things that we did at USAID when I was there was to highlight the role of the private sector in development. And as part of the aid transformation, we set up a private sector engagement hub so that there is a one-stop shop for private companies of all sizes, large corporates down to small businesses in the United States, so that they can become involved in the delivery of foreign assistance around the world. It's a job creator for us here at home, but it is also recognition that the private sector is the strongest force in world history for lifting people's lives and for giving people livelihoods that they can depend on for themselves and for their families. And so that added focus at USAID has been something that I would recommend leveraging into the future.
And I would add, I agree entirely with Bonnie, and I think there are 2 additional tools that I would ask Congress to support as much as possible. One is, during my tenure, we used a tool called the Global Development Alliance structure that allowed USAID to partner with the private sector, frankly, in more creative ways than many other parts of the US government. And while that's a small share of USAID programming, I hope it can grow into a larger share. And the second one is the US Global Development Lab. By creating a lab that focused on building technology partnerships and bringing kind of modern science to the tasks at hand, we were able to build partnerships with firms that we otherwise would not have been able to, and frankly, attract a certain kind of talent to the institution in a way that's unique. So I would call out both of those tools in addition.
Thank you. I have one more question, but I will go.
Go ahead.
Oh,
Sure.
The chairman's being gracious with our time. And I did have one last question regarding the supply chain. If you had any thoughts on COVID's impact on the supply chain, both from a manufacturing and a distribution standpoint. You may or may not. I just thought I'd throw it out there to see if you, both of you are very wise and perhaps have your own recommendations there on how we can address that issue.
Maybe I'll jump in on this. I do think if you look at the estimates of what will cause disruption to the global economy post the United States and other industrial nations achieving herd immunity through vaccination, it is the sanctity of global supply chains that are causing the estimates to be between $3 and $9 trillion of economic loss as a result of basically disrupted supply chains. USAID has lots of partnerships with companies and as parts of its programs that build and support those types of supply chains. So I think that's yet another reason why the institution should be sort of strengthened and invested in this period going forward, which frankly will be a longer period than I think most people realize. It's not just a threat for 6 months or 12 months, it's probably a threat for 3 to 5 years, because that's most likely the time frame required to really get ahead of COVID-19 in the emerging world.
All right, let me
Just add to that real quick,
please.
the criticality of securing the supply chain, which is the most sophisticated supply chain on earth and capable of delivering life-saving medications to the village level around the world, the criticality of investing in that, and also ensuring that through onshoring, nearshoring, and allied shoring, our products and manufacturing from the United States and our allies to bring it closer to the village level is what's going to make a monumental difference in being able to distribute vaccines and everything else that's needed to rebuild global economies.
Thank you. All right, I'm going to go now to the Vice Chair of the Subcommittee, Representative Jacobs from San Diego.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for being here. I want to go to a specific problem that we're seeing around the world. I think the pandemic has exposed just how difficult digital learning can be, both here in the US and abroad. But it's not new. USAID and others have had many programs over the years to distribute computers and tablets and internet connectivity to underserved communities. In my estimation, some of these programs, such as one laptop per child, sound really great in theory, but when you actually look at the data, have had very mixed successes. And so I was wondering, in both of your opinions, if you think USAID is adequately applying the lessons learned from those past failures in digital learning projects to meet these new challenges, what you think those lessons are, and what more we can do here to ensure, as we're implementing these projects, we're doing it in the best way possible.
So one of the areas of extreme focus when I was at USAID, because I came from a technology background, was a focus on digital technology in the application and rollout of USAID programs. In order for the agency to be equipped for the 21st century, we launched a digital strategy 11 months ago. It was supposed to be in person, and of course it was virtual, which seems appropriate, of course. And what we have focused on is an approach at USAID that is digital first. Look for ways to apply solutions using digital technologies that are available. But the critical technology that has to reach the shores of developing countries in order for countries to become self-reliant and competitive in global markets is 5G. And in order for 5G to be rolled out in a democratic manner, one of the things that we focused on was ensuring that secure 5G solutions were available around the world. We can get into the software that can enable this as well as the infrastructure, but 5G and secure 5G is the critical element for digital technology and bringing education, job opportunities, et cetera, to emerging markets.
Former Administrator Shah, do you have anything to add, particularly on how we're getting these digital learning techniques out to the hardest to reach students around the world?
Well, I want to thank you for the question. During my time there, I found that it's true that some programs that get a lot of visibility were not necessarily able to deliver quite as much, but there are plenty of efforts within U.S. investments in education access that were quietly very successful at getting new tools and technologies to very, very remote communities. And I had a chance to visit many of them, one in rural Nepal, for example. And I was struck by both the effectiveness and the measurement they had put in place to track 3rd and 4th grade literacy and math scores associated with that, and made that sort of practice we try to replicate broadly. The other thing I would say is this is not the kind of task that I think America should try to handle in just a bilateral context. Investing in digitization and digital infrastructure, broadband access, and 5G is a task that America can help lead together with the World Bank, and potentially together with the use of certain types of IMF resources that seem like they will be made available to lower income nations, because this can all be part of a focused recovery effort to restart the economy and create kind of a jobs-rich economic recovery in many emerging economies. So I hope that the approach can be bilateral and multilateral.
Great, thank you. My next question is kind of addressing that poverty. We've seen that this pandemic has erased 10 years of the income gains for the first time since the 1990s, and global poverty rates are increasing, as you've mentioned in your testimony. I was wondering, besides additional funding, which I think we all recognize as an issue, what more can USAID programs be doing with our partners or otherwise to combat poverty, and what can we do to support USAID to meet those goals?
Well, maybe I'll start with that. I think there are two big things I think that we can do besides funding. The first is really work with multilateral institutions to coordinate the impact of rescue and recovery packages. So, for example, if the International Monetary Fund is able to provide an allocation of what are called special drawing rights, but basically new resources to emerging economies, in that context, it would be great to see USAID and other bilateral institutions sort of partnering with the World Bank and the IMF and the development banks to make sure those many billions of dollars are deployed effectively and are really focused on the response and the recovery. I think the second component is making sure that we have a longer time horizon on these efforts. There's a big risk that, the programming we do is sort of 1 year time frame kind of programming. And the reality is the recovery needed to avoid the loss of 2 decades of human development progress is going to take 5, 6, 7, 8 years. And I would love to see more long-term thinking applied, because this moment calls for it. Otherwise, as you point out, we will lose 1 or 2 decades of progress fighting poverty, fighting disease, and fighting a lack of educational access for girls across the world.
And I agree wholeheartedly with that, and particularly working with multilateral institutions. One of the things that we saw in the fall meetings at the World Bank was a call by World Bank President Malpass for debt relief for the poorest countries that have been impacted by COVID. And this is an area, too, where these same countries that have been so severely impacted on many levels have been impacted because they have bought into the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, and they are heavily, heavily indebted to the People's Republic of China. It's a great opportunity for the world to focus on debt relief for the most indebted countries and to call on the People's Republic of China for debt relief.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. We'll go now to Representative Issa.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Glick, under your leadership at USAID, the agency developed key strategies and policy documents such as the digital strategy and private sector engagement policy. Can you comment on recommendations for the Biden administration to continue or expand your initiatives?
Congressman Issa, thank you so much for the question. And it's really an important one for all administrations to recognize. I worked hard at USAID to bring it into the 21st century. And I'm hopeful that the non-controversial, highly lauded efforts that were undertaken to engage with the private sector as true partners around using digital tools to deliver development, including the recognition that 5G is an imperative, not just for developed economies, but for emerging markets too. I hope and I trust that the momentum behind these efforts carries forward. We socialized private sector engagement in our approach to 5G, to food distribution, to supply chain management with other donors, as well as across the US government. We had a particular engagement with the Federal Communications Commission. In fact, I signed an MOU with former FCC Chair Ajit Pai to have our two agencies collaborate on the rollout of 4G and 5G systems to developing countries. There's broad recognition that in the 21st century, no country will develop if it doesn't have appropriate digital tools and if children aren't educated on the use of these tools. So this is where USAID can partner effectively with the private sector, particularly with local private sectors, to deliver solutions worldwide. For the Biden team, I'll just say that the career staff at USAID is excited and more than capable to continue their focus on private sector engagement and on the digital strategy. They feel it's relevant and connected to the goals of self-reliance, and they're leading the agency into the 21st century, and others are eagerly joining in.
Thank you. And hopefully this is a quick yes or no question. One of the anomalies in the USAID package continues to be in excess of $1 million a year that is spent on Cyprus, a member of the European Union and certainly not a developing nation. Would it be fair to say that Congress needs to at least address the question of whether that pot of money, the U.S. aid pot, should be spent on a disagreement, continued tension between the Greeks and the Turks in Cyprus, or whether, if we're going to make that investment, it should be made in some other way, particularly since it is a contingent expenditure?
Sir, it's a great question, and I would just say that this is really where congressional oversight is so important, and I urge that.
Thank you. Lastly, and this is for both our witnesses, you know, having spent 2 years associated with the Trade Development Agency, you're one of your sister organizations, and beginning to realize from the time I was originally nominated for it that TDA, USAID, the Ex-Im Bank, our entire plethora of agencies is dwarfed by China's engagement in Belt and Road, and you mentioned 5G and their obvious desire to dominate 5G and to dominate, if you will, the information gathering behind those systems they install. Could you each give us your view of what the vision should be for Congress and for this administration to create a system through any or all of those agencies that would be able to compete aggressively and fairly for those system developments throughout the world?
Sure, Congressman, it's wonderful to see you again. And I would just say, you know, you're right. The Belt and Road Initiative is $1 trillion public-private, if you can call it that, collaboration.
Public, we might call it, considering the nature of those private companies.
Exactly. But there is a significant amount of commercial capital included in that $1 trillion, and it is funding everything from 108 gigawatts of new coal development to all kinds of projects that have less than transparent documentation with respect to meeting basic Western standards for anti-corruption and transparency around public-private investments. So there is a tremendous need for the United States, in my view, to continue to invest in elevating the U.S. Development Finance Corporation and ensuring that America's foreign assistance agencies are working in concert with that institution, as well as with the World Bank and the IMF, that do focus on putting forward, you know, call it Western standards of governance of the economy and of economic transactions, and making sure that Bretton Woods system, together with the United States, can actually be an effective alternative proposition to the 23 or 26 countries that are, you know, currently actively participating in the Belt and Road Initiative. And to do that, we have to focus more on making concessional finance available at much larger levels. We We have to focus more on the kinds of industries countries value, like energy generation and electricity distribution and access. And we have to be much more focused on public-private collaborations to that end. And the Rockefeller Foundation actually works on exactly those issues and would be happy to collaborate. But I do think that is what it will take to present a counter that is meaningful given the scale of the Belt Road Initiative.
Ms. Glick, you want to
Congressman,
give Congressman Issa a quick answer on that also?
Congressman, the quick answer on that too is the one component that China leaves out and we don't is the $60 trillion of U.S. industry that are involved in the rollout of large-scale infrastructure around the world. So while U.S. government is dwarfed by the PRC, and as you rightly noted, which is a public-public partnership with companies like Huawei and ZTE, the public-private engagement to bring in the private sector of the United States bumps our numbers up tenfold at least over potential Chinese investments. And so that's where I would urge that the Congress focus, that agency's focus is on true partnership with the private sector.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Representative Omar.
Thank you. I just wanted to start out thanking you, Chairman, and the ranking member for holding this important hearing. It's exciting to be here for the first hearing of this new committee and looking forward to doing great work together. The World Poverty Clock estimates that up to 120 million people have been thrown into extreme poverty because of COVID. Extreme poverty meaning that their households live on less than $1.90 a day. The people bearing the burden of this life live in the South, the global South, especially Sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. Last year, I led a letter with Senator Bernie Sanders and more than 300 parliamentarians around the world to the World Bank, the IMF, and G20 country leaders. Our letter asked for serious consideration of debt cancellation as a way to address the rise of global poverty. One of the things we asked was for the IMF to issue special drawing rights, which could provide hundreds of millions of dollars in immediate relief to the world's poorest countries. Mr. Chairman, I would like to introduce into the record this article in the Financial Times from the UN Economic Commission for Africa, Vera Singh, making the case for using SDRs for Africa.
Without objection, it's entered into the record.
Dr. Shah, you have been supportive of special drawing rights as a way to alleviate the economic crisis. Secretary Yellen has also shown support for this policy. Dr. Shah, can you explain how the IMF issuing SDRs will help ensure countries in Africa respond to the pandemic?
Sure. Thank you, Congresswoman, for your leadership on these issues and your commitment. In particular, the opportunity for the United States to support a G20-led coalition to enable the IMF to allocate greater special drawing rights across its member nations would create, depending on the scale of that issuance, potentially, up to $600 or $700 billion of value that can then be allocated to nations based on their shares of the IMF. And in the past, we saw this coming out of the crisis when Gordon Brown was prime minister, coming out of the global financial crisis. And we saw some smaller actions in this front last year. Wealthier nations then would have the opportunity to take those SDRs, as they're referenced, and donate them or on-lend them back to the IMF's Poverty Reduction Growth Trust to be used for nations that have much greater need in this moment. And that effectively doesn't cost the wealthier nations anything in the current moment. So it's a way of generating fiscal support for developing countries at a scale that is much greater than what I suspect America can do by acting bilaterally alone. And it's an effort then to make sure those additional resources that go to those developing nations are then used for health and economic recovery so that COVID-19 can be tackled on the ground and can be dealt with, and the recovery can be much stronger. I'd say two points for this committee to sort of consider and perhaps encourage. The first is America's participation in this effort would send such a powerful signal to the rest of the world that we're willing to work through multilateral institutions to, in a very efficient way, make resources available during a crisis. And the second is America, by partnering its bilateral and multilateral agencies and efforts, has the opportunity to, in particular, ensure that these resources, which could be, tens of billions of new dollars for the health response specifically, are used effectively to fill this ACT accelerator identified gap of $23 billion that I spoke about in my opening statement. So right now, as we look across the world at the Rockefeller Foundation, this is one of the few tools the planet has to relatively quickly put resources into play at that scale, and we hope that it can move forward.
Wonderful. And I know we're running out of time, but I wanted you to quickly maybe tell us what should the United States do to make sure vaccines are distributed quickly to Africa, Latin America, and the rest of the global South?
Well, I think two things. The first is the immediate injection of the $4 billion to COVAX and the Global Alliance for Vaccines will make it possible to achieve the procurement goals Gavi has set, or COVAX has set. As you know, that is still only trying to achieve 20% coverage for vaccination, and you need to get to 60, 70, 80% to really get herd immunity. So the two things I think is the US needs to continue to make sure some of these multilateral tools like SDRs can be linked to further efforts to expand vaccination. And the second one is America has been a leader in investing through USAID in particular and PEPFAR in particular at building the health systems needed on the ground to make sure these products are actually delivered to people in need. And now seems like a moment where continued American leadership on that specific task can be of tremendous value to the world.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Shah. Thank you, Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Representative Omar. Let's go to Representative Sherman.
Thank you. Today we're going to pass a $1.9 trillion bill. Less than 1% of that is there to help the world deal with this problem. And yet that less than 1% has been subject to the most scathing, cheap political attacks. The fact is we have a strong interest in getting the world immunized. A diplomat would tell you that our standing in the world is dependent upon our contribution to world immunization. A theologian would tell you that we must help the least of these and that we have a moral obligation. An economist would point out that our economy cannot fully recover while our trading partners are sheltering in place. And a virologist will tell you that with over 7 billion people in the world, until they all get immunity or the benefits of herd immunity, the virus has a chance to infect. Where it infects, it replicates. Where it replicates, it mutates, and it could easily mutate into a form that then is a problem for the United States. So if we were interested only in ourselves, we would work toward world immunization as quickly as possible. Yet there are two issues here. One is the distribution, and I think that will be dealt with by others in this hearing. And the other is the shortage of vaccine. And here's where the United States has been particularly short-sighted. There are research studies that I think will show that, at least for people under age 55, only half the dosage is needed. Yet there are those who say we shouldn't fund those studies because we won't have the results until May, and by then Americans will be immunized, and who cares about the rest of the world? That's stupid. right now, we are wasting over 10% of the vaccine because the FDA instructs people who are administering the vaccine to, if there's half a dosage left in the bottle, throw away the bottle, rather than get half the dosage from this bottle and half the dosage from the next bottle, which are part of the same manufacturing line. Dr. Shah, it is great to see you back before our committee, now in a new role. Are we doing enough to study how we can stretch the existing vaccine and how we can manufacture vaccine more quickly, not with the finish line being May 31st, because that's when Americans are vaccinated, but with a goal of immunizing the vast majority of people in the world.
Thank you, Congressman, for your statement, and it's good to see you again. I do agree that the need to identify vaccine efficacy strategies via research will continue to be a significant requirement, certainly well beyond May and potentially for years to come. And I think you might think of it as covering a number of different areas of research and inquiry. The first, as you point out, is the efficacy of current vaccines against current variants that are present in the viral population. And, both are going to be changing over time. So it's really not something you can just end the research on. You have to continue to do it. The second is actually monitoring the variants that emerge from developing and emerging economies, and frankly, in the United States. Now, in the United States, the CDC has crafted, together with the NIH, a very strong plan for raising the level of genomic surveillance to track viral variants. But
I would point out they've been very late to do that, but now.
Yeah, they've been very late to do it, but now there's a plan to do it. I think the country that has done it best is the United Kingdom. And they've done it in a public-private partnership with the Wellcome Trust and others. We're working with, and we hope the U.S. can play a very big role in replicating what they've done there in emerging environments and developing countries around the world where very little to no viral genomic surveillance is taking place. And I would say that's just as important as the other question of vaccine efficacy. And then finally, as part of all of this, there needs to be ways to constantly test existing vaccines and convalescent plasma against the new variants that do emerge. And that's another area that will require continued research. So I think the research enterprise here has to be global and has to persist, frankly, for many years after most people hopefully move beyond thinking of COVID-19 as a day-to-day challenge.
Thank you. I would just comment that there is nothing that's more penny wise and pound foolish than us to fail to spend on the things you identify. That if we can get people vaccinated against the variants that we're aware of, that will reduce the replications and mutations that can give us a variant that does not yet exist. And it is perhaps the best expenditure of American resources to do a lot more than 1% of our expenditures on stopping this worldwide. I also want to take a moment to commend Mr. Castro, our chair, on being the first to chair any hearing of this subcommittee in history, and I look forward to more hearings as good as this one, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Sherman. All right, let's go over to Ms. Houlihan.
Thank you, and I want to echo Mr. Sherman's commendations. This is a really important and exciting new subcommittee, and I actually want to focus on the title or the name of the subcommittee, which has in it corporate social interests, global corporate social interests. And my first question is for Mr. Shah. I really am interested in corporate accountability. Our companies, corporations across the globe really talk a big game about social impact and responsibility.
Well, it looks like Ms. Houlihan's video froze there. Let's see if we can get her back here for a few seconds. And if not, then we'll go. Why don't we go to Mr. Kim, and then we'll come right back to Ms. Houlihan. Mr. Kim.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Chairman, for pulling this together. I wanted to, and we'll turn it back to my colleague Chrissy Houlihan after this, as hopefully her bandwidth gets better. I was looking through your testimony, and you gave some really thoughtful remarks about some of the things that we should be doing, especially when it comes to China. And one of them was about the World Health Organization. And you were proposing some different reforms there on that level. I've heard that from both people who've been supporters and critics of the WHO that we should be looking into reforms. What I want to just say, reporting body, in the aftermath of the pandemic, trying to think about what do we need as a global structure to be able to make sure that we are better prepared for the next time around. And I think I want to just kind of hear a little more from you, because some of the language you use really spot on with where I'm thinking, but also some of it, like when you say kind of trimmed back WHO, it concerns me because in the aftermath of a pandemic, wouldn't we want to have more abilities to be able to engage globally when it comes to health? And I'm sure that's something you agree with as well, but perhaps it means a different entity or different structure is put into place. So if you can just kind of elaborate on that a little further.
So there was a little bit of a lag there, and I'm not sure I heard the entirety of your question, Congressman, but I think it was directed to me. And I want to thank you for, one, reading the testimony, and two, for the very thoughtful question about the World Health Organization. When the Trump administration made the decision to leave the WHO, there really was a lot of consternation in the international donor community. But there was no other time during which a U.S. exit from what is a malfunctioning international organization could have had a greater impact than during that pandemic itself. WHO has been on a slow slog toward complete dysfunction. And while this was made manifest to the world during the initial COVID-19 outbreak, it was obvious to global health practitioners and to people who were suffering from the Ebola outbreak in Eastern Congo before COVID-19 hit the world stage. The WHO was broken. So the focused attention that the Trump administration brought to WHO's failings in Wuhan has hopefully gone a long way to starting the reform of it. And I hope that a U.S. reentry into WHO will live up to its original mandate of global health coordination, but it needs some significant reforms. The Biden administration should continue to press for reform. WHO doesn't have to be all things health related to nations all over the world, but rather it should maintain the high-level coordinating function that it was established to have. So we may have forced some tough medicine onto the WHO, but I do think that, as you noted, a trimmed back WHO may be a better coordinating body than the current WHO that's dispersed in 150 countries around the world and really micro-focused rather than focused on broad global concerns. Thank you so much for the question.
Yeah, thank you, Ms. Glick. I mean, look, I'm open to looking at some of these reforms and looking for how we can improve the coordination when it comes to the WHO and the function there. But again, while we're thinking about that, I would also need to just understand more clearly going forward, what other structures that we put in place to have some of the oversight. If some of the problem was, the lack of the WHO being able to do proper inspections and oversights and aspects like that, I worry about trimming back. I worry about that kind of language in terms of how we push on that. So that's what I was just trying to get at. Perhaps it's not the WHO that needs to play those functions, but we need to put sort of a bigger apparatus together, how we move forward in the aftermath of this pandemic, once we're able to really assess on that. And I hope you're right that the Biden team thinks very thoughtfully, carefully about how we can structure that. So if you don't mind, I'd love to just stay in touch with you, Ms. Glick and Dr. Shah, about that in terms of just understanding that broader ecosystem in which, you know, we pull together what kind of public health and global health foundation and infrastructure we need going forward. And with that, I'll turn it back to the chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Kim. All right, we're going to circle back to Ms. Houlihan. Hopefully we got the technical issues solved. Ms. Houlihan? Still a lag, perhaps?
I think you're muted.
Hello, can you guys hear me? Yes?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Excellent. Excellent. I really want to direct my questions to the first one to Dr. Shah. And one of the things that excites me most about the new committee has to do with this emphasis on global corporate social responsibility and interest. And my question is, considering the kind of the power of the for-profit sector of our economy and the global economy, how can we, Dr. Shah, help to drive corporate accountability for the social impact that many of our companies have the ability to have? A lot of our companies, particularly when we speak to pandemic and their opportunities to help on a global scale and to help address these issues, talk a really big game, but they don't necessarily follow through on it. And so I was wondering if you might be able to comment on, you know, the importance of global social and environmental responsibility on the part of the for-profit sector, if that's something that you might be able to comment on for us.
Sure. Thank you for that question. And I am glad that that concept is built into the structure of this committee. It is true that there have been, you know, a number of different efforts to enable companies to, in a more systematic manner, report regularly on their performance on economic, social, and governance issues as it relates both to domestic and international priorities. And I think we need to continue to encourage and establish those types of standards of reporting. If you look at and Rockefeller does a fair amount of this work, and as a social investor is also actively investing in ESG or companies that claim to do better on economic, social, and governance issues. And the challenge there has always been transparency and reporting. So a company that pays very low wages or contracts out much of its work and avoids most labor protections as doing so can also have a very attractive marketing campaign around a few special projects and create the impression that, you know, that they're doing well across all these issues. There are some indices out there. In particular, Just Capital is a platform that I think is doing very good work on creating indicators and rankings of companies, in that case across the Russell 1000, that is a more sophisticated way of understanding corporate social responsibility and impact related to it. And I think an outstanding path forward for our country would be having some of those types of more serious reporting requirements built into corporate accounting very broadly and required in one form or another.
I really appreciate that, and I appreciate the connection that we have today, and hope to be able to follow up with you on those particular subjects. And I know I have a short amount of time, so if it's okay, I'd like to transition over to a different subject, which I'm very passionate about, which is women and girls. This pandemic has been really devastating to everyone, but I think particularly to women and girls across this country and the globe. I was wondering, what is the most important thing that we can be doing with USAID to address the gender implications of the pandemic? Where should we be focusing our efforts? And the question is for both of you. Perhaps we'll start with Ms. Glick, please.
Sure, and thanks for the great question and for that genuine level of concern. We know that women and girls are the most vulnerable populations, and one of the things that is predicted to be one of the secondary or tertiary impacts of COVID-19 is going to be the impact that it has on livelihoods, on gender-based violence, and on basic education. And the real concern is access. access to livelihoods for women, out-migration very often of their male partners to other countries in search of higher wages, and to girls in terms of access to education. One of the areas where USAID can make a difference, I believe, again, is in the provision of education through digital technology. We're seeing creative ways, working with important partners like UNICEF, to bring education to internally displaced people, to refugee camps, using technology in a way that has never been used before. So there's keen awareness that the issues as they relate to girls, to their continuing education, to gender-based violence, as well as to the needs for women to be active and engaged in the marketplace are really felt within USAID, I believe. One of the areas, too, where the United States shines and USAID really shines, I will say, is in the delivery of the maternal and child health systems around the world. Because of the investments that have been made by the United States, more and more women and girls have access to health care and family planning. One of the other areas where we've made investments, and this Congress is upping those investments, is with Gavi, the Global Vaccine Alliance, and ensuring that children have access in some of the poorest countries to vaccinations, which will allow us to move from those levels of malnutrition and poor health as children into healthier young adults and then into engaged members of the economy.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. I know I've run out of time, but I do want to, foot stomp on the importance of health in women and girls, and I look forward to reintroducing my bill on funding the UNFPA again. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Houlihan. And that concludes the questions from our members of Congress to our witnesses. I'd like to thank everyone again for joining us for our subcommittee's first hearing. I'd particularly like to thank our witnesses for their expert testimony. You've given this Congress a lot to consider as we seek to rebuild our nation's international development capacity and workforce. For the past year, the COVID-19 pandemic has done much to expose and widen the fractures in societies around the world. Even as the pandemic causes new challenges for U.S. development policy, we find that American leadership in this space is more necessary than ever. I trust that the workforce of USAID and the State Department are up to the challenge, and I'm committed to ensuring that this Congress provides them with the support they need. Working together with international partners and organizations, I'm confident we can build a safer, healthier, and more prosperous world for all of our people, and in so doing, ensure the safety, health, and prosperity of our own nation. And we look forward to the work ahead. Thank you. And with that, we're adjourned.
This meeting is no longer being
you, Chairman.
recorded.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.